Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this series of conversations around the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Debanshu. The focus of today's discussion is the economy. What started primarily as a health crisis quickly evolved into a full-blown economic crisis, not only in India, but all across the world. To discuss the implications of the crisis on the economy and evaluate the need for having a separate crisis management agency, we have with us former Union Finance Secretary, Mr. Sumit Bose, who also happens to be the chairman of our board, and my colleague Aishwarya Satija, who's a research fellow in the financial regulation team in our organization. Thank you both of you for your time. We are living through one of the most bizarre economic periods of our time. An economic crisis typically progresses in 3 stages. In stage 1, you have an economic shock, like a stock market crash. Then in stage 2, this shock kind of permeates into the larger financial sector. Investors start selling their assets. Nobody really understands what the true value of their holdings are. Creditors stop giving loans to each other. And there is like chaos in the market. And then in the 3rd stage, there's this spillover on the real economy, where businesses run out of cash. They don't have enough money to pay their loans. They don't have enough money to pay salaries to their employees. There are job losses. And then you have this drop in demand in the market. And this vicious cycle kind of continues. But unfortunately, in this crisis, we seem to have entered into stage 3 directly. Production levels are down, consumption has come down. There are labor supply mismatches all over. And there is a general consensus that the economy is in a bad shape. And before discussing our proposal, I just wanted to start with you, Mr. Bose, and ask you about your assessment of the crisis itself. And how would you evaluate the government's response so far?
Thank you, Debanshu. It's wonderful to be part of this event related to Vidhi's briefing book for the current year. As I have stated in my introduction to the briefing book, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a trifecta of an health emergency, which you spoke of, massive health emergency, an unimaginable humanitarian crisis we have all witnessed and are, I think it's still unfolding, and of course an unprecedented economic crisis or the economic fallout. That too is unraveling. The government has come out with responses. There's this Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana been rolled out. We've had food grain supplies to free food grains being given out, along with cash transfers. Mixed success. I think food grains has reached out to almost at least 80-85% of the rural population. So says the Dalberg survey. Urban areas, less so. There's a problem there. Cash transfers, I find that they say about 43% only have been able to utilize the funds which they have received in the bank. They have not been able to pull that out of the bank. That's a serious problem, and some correction is needed there. We've had this, and that's related to the sort of crisis in the rural areas. A whole lot of agricultural reforms have also been announced. But those will unfold. I mean, that cannot have immediate impact. The immediate impact has been the good monsoon and the good procurement, through which about 65-70,000 crores have reached farmers. So the estimates of something like that are bandied about, and they have reached the farmers. So rural areas, Manrega works are going on. There's been some improvement. There's some report now of slowing down of the economy, of the employment rate in the rural areas. That too is there. Would be there. Urban areas, there's still, I think, a lot of misery. I just told you about what happened in the food grains there. Whatever has been announced for small shopkeepers yet to be rolled out. I think there isn't a Manrega-like program now in the urban areas, although it's much talked about that something will be announced. We've had a whole lot of measures for SMEs. We've had the RBI aggressively bringing down rates. How much of it has actually been passed on? that's another point, because apparently banks have passed on only about 45 basis points of that in at the rates which they're giving credit. But there have been these measures. But I think, to set it in context, the economy is already slowing down as we approach COVID. I think that is really the context we must see this. And we must see that in the years before this slowing down, or the last few years, the role of exports, the role of private consumption has come down, the role of public consumption has gone up. So in public consumption, it is the fiscal deficit which matters, is how much you spend. And whether we've been spending enough, that's really now what the government has to assess, what they have to read. I think everyone is scrambling around looking for green shoots. That's a good thing to do. But ultimately, if there are green shoots, it'll show up, or else you have to take action. And I think if you look at both the crisis and the need to prop up demand, there's obviously through public consumption, you have to do it. You will actually have to raise the level of government spending. I think there is no taking away from that. And through that spending, you have to spend on infrastructure. You have to ensure that the states have enough to spend also, not just the government of India. And I think that is what will be required. Now, the timing of that, we hear all sorts of statements that will be timed when actually it's opening up more. We've got some more control on COVID. But the fact is that more needs to be done. And I'm sure it will be done, but now more certainly needs to be done on all fronts to alleviate misery, the humanitarian crisis, as well as the economy. I'll tell you, the pensions, for example, which the government of India hands out, including to various disadvantaged, say, widows, old age pension, they have not been revised for 8-9 years. States also add on. But I'm just giving you an example of that sort of thing, where in this crisis, obviously something more needs to be done on the fiscal side. So, bank lending, yes. Whether banks can be made less risk averse, how they will be, what will drive them, all that is there. But I think really something on the demand side, something which really creates a little more demand, and not just in the rural areas. It has to be a little more widespread, including the urban areas. We hear some good news. I mean, demand for tractors has gone up, for example, in the rural areas. Good thing. Fertilizer sales is up. Good thing. But much more needs to be done.
Understood. So clearly, the big takeaway is that the government seems to have done a lot. But in my assessment, there seems to be some lack of coordination, because different ministries are doing different things. You have different things happening at the level of the central government and the state governments. So is there a case for a more coordinated, structured response? And here, Aishwarya, I'd like to hear your views. What's your proposal for a more structured and cohesive response to the crisis?
Right. Thank you, Debanshu. As rightly pointed out, the current state of the economy is worrying, to say the least. And while the dip in the economy began before COVID-19 came to India, the pandemic has certainly made things much worse. It is often said that crisis is the birthplace for creative policy making. So though there are many measures which have been taken or are yet to be taken by the government to make the present crisis sufferers, give them some relief, however, this is also a good time to relook at institutions and structures that exist in our regulatory landscape and question their efficiency. One of the things that happened during the last global financial crisis in 2007-8 is similar, where many countries realized that there were gaps in their financial regulatory system. Policymakers realized that sectoral regulators are important and provide much needed expertise and focus in regulation. However, relying solely on sectoral regulators also leads to myopic results. For example, a securities regulator or a banking regulator may come up with policies that are very good for their particular sector, but this policy may ignore interlinkages, may not be a coordinated holistic response that either promotes economic growth or financial stability. And this becomes even worse during a crisis. But this is a problem that remains in policy throughout the time, even without coming into a crisis. So how did policymakers respond then? One of the key reforms that took place in many countries, including India, was that certain bodies were created as regulatory bodies or other functioning agencies that focused specifically on macroeconomic growth and financial stability for the whole economy and not just for specific sectors. It was thought that if something like this is created on top of sectoral regulation, it would help in bridging gaps, overcoming overlaps, and avoiding regulatory arbitrage that this fragmented structure of regulators creates. The thing that was done in India was that this body called Financial Stability and Development Council, or FSDC as we will refer to it, was created. And it was the need of the hour, arguably, at that time. However, there are limitations in its functioning, which can be one of the reasons why it hasn't given us the results that we expected in 2010 during its creation. The FSDC is a non-statutory body. I'm so sorry. Right. The FSDC is a non-statutory body, which means that it is opaque in its functioning. Sorry, there's some problem with this. Yeah, there's opaque. It's opaque in its functioning, and it often isn't based in policies of often isn't governed by rule of law. So, for example, there isn't mandate on the FSDC to release information that it comes up with, info policies that it comes up with. If you go to the FSDC website, it is very skeletal. It releases information such as when the FSDC meets, who is part of FSDC, but does not go much beyond in creating transparency. It's also arguable to say that independence is lacking because of this way that FSDC is created. It is within the Ministry of Finance, and though it includes representation from other government regulators, it isn't independent by necessity. It may be in functioning, but the lack of a statute does compromise that independence, especially in a body that will be required to critique or otherwise make changes to policies that are already adopted by other government bodies or regulators, which is a big problem in its functioning. Therefore, what we propose in our proposal, in our briefing book, is the creation of a crisis management agency, which is set up as a statutory body under the Ministry of Finance and replaces the FSDC. What we think this will do is overcome the inadequacies of the present structures by being based in principles of accountability and of transparency. We propose that this crisis management agency that you create through statute should have two focuses. One is macroprudential policy, and so it should come up with perhaps recommendations in terms of policy changes or new policies that can be adopted by regulators, central governments, and state governments to better promote economic growth that is more holistic and that is not based on one sector's outcomes. We also think that it should perform a supervisory role as well, in the way that it should make recommendations or at least analyze if current regulatory bodies are performing up to the task, or if there is something that they're missing out, and it should point that out. Apart from this, we recommend that the board of the agency should consist of central government representatives, state government representatives, as well as representatives from regulators, all of whom are related to the financial sector. The reason we say this is because a big problem, as you pointed out, Debanshu, is interregulatory coordination and interdepartmental coordination. And this is where we can leverage this by having them in the same place together. That being said, there are problems or at least arguments on both sides of having state government representatives within this. Though a lot of people who have recommended FSDC type structures agree that there should definitely be regulators and central government representation, state government is often one of the areas where there are arguments on both sides. On the one side, you can argue that having state government representatives is including too many cooks, it will spoil the broth. However, the argument on the other side is that there are some important areas that are governed by states. For example, cooperative banks come within the state list. And therefore, even when we see right now, there are a lot of people who've pointed out that there is a lack of coordination between responses within by states and responses by center. Therefore, we do believe that there is merit in considering inclusion of states. That being said, it's always up to argue the way in which you include states, or the extent, or if it should be on the same level as a central government or a regulatory representative, or not, considering that it's a more holistic macroeconomic analysis. Those are the broad contours of our regulation, of our proposal. And the aim of our proposal is to have a body which comes up with more holistic recommendations, which sectoral regulators can choose or choose to not adopt, but which promotes macroeconomic considerations in our policymaking.
Okay, so a super macro-prudential regulator, so to speak, to manage the crisis better. Now, Mr. Bose, you have served in the government at the highest levels, both in the central government and at the level of the state government. You've also served as a chairman of a committee on mis-selling of financial products that involved a lot of these interregulatory issues. So what's your take on this proposal? Do you think it's practical in the Indian context?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I welcome the proposal made in the briefing book. We, of course, have the FSDC. Now, the FSDC came out in, of the Raghuram Rajan committee report in 2010. It was set up, and it has been functioning. It meets regularly. It puts out a cryptic sort of a press note. To that extent, it's working. But I've heard regulators say that, especially after this expansion in somewhere in 2015, that far too many people actually attended. Now all the secretaries in the ministry are members, and some of the other than the ministry, I think from corporate affairs also they are members. So almost it's a room full of people, and whenever the room fills up with senior people, there are people also occupying the chairs behind them also. So I've heard this complaint from regulators. On the other hand, the subcommittee, which is the RBI governor chairs that all the regulators feel is a more effective body. So I think at a minimum, what the briefing book does is to bring back focus on this FSDC. Now, whether it's this FSDC, whether it's a crisis management agency, you have put the spotlight back on the need to make this forum for interregulatory supervision on the macro economy. I think that is a very important function which the briefing book has done. You see, we have always had problem, and we continue to have I think all jurisdictions have some problem on interregulatory matters. And now that the spotlight is there, how do we make them work better? I think there will be a focus on that. State governments, you mentioned state government, and I too think, rightly Aishwarya brought out both sides of it. The state governments need to be consulted, but whether they can be part of that forum, because at one level we are trying to make it a more sort of compact forum, but we need definitely to listen to the states. I recall Vidhi's briefing book, I think it's up 2015 or 16, where he brought this out on cooperative federalism. There were at least 3 issues there: urban cooperative banks, microfinance, and chit funds, which related, across regulators and economy-wide problems, not just related to the state. There could be multi-state issues involving that. So so that's a very good thing which has happened out of the briefing book, the spotlight. That commission, committee that you mentioned, Debanshu, that was actually came out of the FSDC proceedings. I think they felt that it was needed, and we looked at the issue of mis-selling and the commissions and various products, and I think we made certain recommendations. key recommendation of that report was that the function, that regulation should be made according to the function of the product. It should be regulated according to the function of the product, not by form. And function means insurance, investments, and annuity. And in many products, especially on the insurance side, insurance and investment is all mixed up. That impacts, first of all, the consumer, the investor. He is being cheated. Then, of course, this entire rampant mis-selling and the front ending of commission, all that was related. But that was an example of where interregulatory sort of consideration on various issues was needed. So that report actually went to the FSDC, and then the FSDC in turn gave it out to the regulator. Some things were implemented. A lot of it has not. Certainly, we haven't had this regulation by function.
Understood. So in our assessment too, it's given the fact that most of these sectoral regulators have their own regulatory objectives, and obviously the state government and the central government would have their own domains to look at, and coordination is a huge challenge. So obviously putting this agency together and making sure that all these different parts of the state work together is going to be a big challenge. But I think the biggest challenge really will be making this thing work properly during a crisis. For something to work well in war, it must work well in peacetime. Now, and therefore, for me, I think the biggest challenge will be this information asymmetry. How do you make sure that this agency has the required powers to make sure that it understands what's going on in the economy? Everybody kind of reports into it. How do you make that work so that it has the required information to be able to deliver in times of crisis? So, Aishwarya, do you have a model for that?
Sure. Yes, Debanshu, thank you. So we did consider this as a big problem while coming up with this recommendation. And so what happens is that multiple regulators already collect data for the regulatory ambit that they have. So a securities regulator will collect a lot of data, and some of it may be collected by other regulators which work in other areas. But a lot of data is collected by sectoral regulators themselves. However, because the regulatory architecture itself is fragmented, and we have noticed that there is a lack of cooperation and data sharing that is made automated, it does often lead to the lack of consolidated data that exists for various aspects of the financial sector. That being said, just to clarify, there are MOUs that regulatory bodies will often enter into to be able to share data with each other. However, this is ad hoc and it's based on discretion, and it still doesn't result in consolidated data creation. However, the way in which through our proposal we tackle this depends on the way in which the body as the crisis management body itself is created. And what we thought of is that there are two different models on which this could be based. So for example, one model can be a cooperation based model where the statute that creates this crisis management agency, for example, says that okay, all these people who collect the data, all these regulatory bodies, government departments, etc., will have a statutory duty to cooperate and give data to the crisis management agency when either demanded or through routine periodic assessments that the agency makes, or give timings for sharing of this data. This could replace the need for MOUs that currently exists and could ease out the ad hoc nature of MOUs that are entered into. The second model is if we give more supervisory sort of power to this agency in the way that we create a data, we create an information database of sorts, in which many agencies and government regulators, etc., are mandated by statute to route their data through. So, for example, if I, as an agency, collect certain data, I am mandated to put up my data or route it through the information database that this crisis management agency can have control over. This is not to say that each regulator will then have access to someone else's data. That is not the intent. The intent is that each regulator should have access to their own data, but it should be put up on a larger information database, which is then handled and managed by the it's also a similar model proposed in the case of
This is, breaking.
was that a financial data of the suggestion, and it happened creating an agenda in budget speeches. So, and if that is if work on it is under this latter model would be a much more suitable model since it's already underway. So those are the two ways in which this could be managed.
Understood. So there are practical ways of dealing with the information asymmetry problem, and if they structure the law properly, they can easily overcome it, and in fact, it can be the first step towards creating this agency. In fact, the government had, was in the process of setting up something similar, the Financial Data Management Center, but I understand that it didn't go anywhere. But let's see how that kind of shapes up. Now, I think we've already overshot our time, but before taking questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask Mr. Bose one final question, and it's kind of linked to the crisis, but in a different way. Right at the outset, sir, you said that because of the crisis, the government expenditure has gone up significantly, and it's because of the revenue losses that businesses are facing. It's very likely that its revenue collection this year is going to go down. So we have kind of a problem from both ends. And so in our briefing book, we also had this other proposal of kind of nudging the government to issue crisis bonds and kind of mobilize capital, not just from the market, but also from retail investors. You sit on the board of the Bombay Stock Exchange, you understand markets well. How practical do you think that proposal is? Do you think that that could be one way of kind of mobilizing capital for funding this crisis, for funding the crisis management? I mean?
See, more funds are required. So government has to issue bonds. And I think it's an excellent idea, what you talk of, raising these, you can call COVID bonds, crisis bonds, by whatever name they are called. And recently, SEBI chairman told seeing that there were a lot of first-time investors now in this exuberance of the stock markets, he warned and he asked them to buy G-Secs. You would have seen his statement. So he's also saying the same thing. Here's a government bond. And I think this could be made a little more attractive to retail. It also gives a sense of participation, I think, in help, as if you're helping the government to raise resources to meet this crisis. It has a patriotic appeal. But then again, there are regulatory issues. It's not. We have to facilitate the retail investor in getting these bonds, and bonds are tradable, to make sure they're able to trade it. Today, a demat account and all a retail investor can handle, but they find it more difficult to handle. There's a specialized account which the RBI mandates if you have to deal with on G-Secs. Now, it's a different structure. It's not the same structure as for the rest for equity. So I think this proposal by itself actually points to this through the fact that there are different regulators for different things, and how if we actually have to facilitate retail investors, not just facilitate them, help them to invest in these bonds, the entire process also needs to be made much more friendly for the investor.
Sorry, I was saying we don't seem to have too many questions here. So unless any of the attendees want to ask their questions now, I'm going to ask another question to Aishwarya. So Aishwarya, one of the arguments is that we don't really need a statutory organization to do it, right? So, but what is the case for having a statutory organization to do it? Why can't we just do it? You indicated that right at the outset in your statement. And have you seen any other jurisdiction kind of have a similar structure where they have kind of used a statutory model to deal with the crisis?
Right. So one of the biggest issues, and this is not to say that the results may not be the same. A statute just guarantees what could happen in practice. It makes it mandatory in a way. So it is possible that through practice, very efficient structures come up. But the issue is that we don't necessarily see that with FSDC. We're also a very legislative country, so to say. We do focus on statutes to then govern structures. We notice that most efficient regulators are creations of statutes. Um, so there are two aspects. One is what is guaranteed, what makes something on paper that is passed and that is more reliable and less left to discretion by creating independent structures, by making sure that a problem, if arises, is governed by rule of law. Um, and makes structures more trustworthy, both by making sure that accountability exists in case things go wrong, and also making sure that transparency exists by putting out information and making it public that this is the work we are doing. It creates a sort of more amount of public trust, not just in general populations, but even in researchers and other people who are outside of the government but do work in policy or suggest policy. It bridges gaps in information asymmetry, because the more opaque operations are, the less reforms can come from outside the government. So it performs a lot of important functions that statutes guarantee. But there's also an argument to say that there are cultural factors. If you look at the rest of how the financial sector or regulatory architecture is structured, so there are arguments on both sides of one, cultural, and second, just purely what a statute guarantees you, which without it can be left on discretion, could lead to similar results, but is not a guarantee. Uh, and we also see that other similar regulators made in other countries are also statutory bodies to the most extent. For example, a similar body exists in the US, which is called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which was created after the last global financial crisis, and contains multiple different representatives from state centers, regulatory bodies, and performs similar functions that we propose, like identification of systemic risks, um, giving out policies, and a little more than we suggest also, but is made on similar lines to promote more macroeconomic policy. Um, this is also a creature of a statute. So it is made through a statute. And so is true for other bodies as well. The Financial Policy Committee, which also performs similar functions in the UK, was made through an amendment to an existing statute, but was inserted as a statutory instrument. So it's about whether we can achieve. If the question is whether we can achieve it without the statute, the answer is yes. If the question is whether that is guaranteed, the answer is no.
Understood. So yeah, so that makes it very, very clear. And in my assessment, even if we find a silver bullet vaccine sometime soon, it's very likely that the economic crisis is going to continue for some time, and not just in India, everywhere. And so therefore, this discussion makes it clear that a statutory agency for monitoring the crisis as it unfolds can be very useful to the government for managing the crisis better. And they could have done it after the last financial crisis 10 years back. They didn't do it. Now we are in the middle of another financial crisis. And I just hope that we don't wait for the next crisis to do this, and we kind of set this up as soon as possible. I will end on that note. We have overshot our time in any case. Thanks again for thanks again, both of you, for joining us, and thanks to all the attendees for participating. We have our last discussion in this series tomorrow. It starts at 5:30 in the evening. It's also on the economy. It's on the interrelationship between business bankruptcy and the crisis. So I hope to see some of you tomorrow. Thanks again, and
thank you.
Thank you.